So let's talk about the fourth subtype for INFPs. We've talked about the dominant, talked about the creative, we've talked about the normalizing. Now let's talk about the harmonizing INFP subtype.
Okay. So these INFPs, and this is the case for most harmonizing subtypes, is that it's more common later in life to be a harmonizing subtype. You can have younger harmonizing subtypes, but it is usually something a person finds over time and through a bit of seasoning. So they're the most multifaceted, sophisticated, and tolerant of all the INFPs. They're more behind the scenes kind of style working, so that they don't really like to put themselves in the limelight necessarily. They don't have that like in charge style. They don't have like a get things going style. They're a little bit more behind the scenes. They facilitate more than anything. And they have kind of a complicated way of seeing things built on, sort of like the fruits of all their experiences in life. And that's why it is most common when they're later in life. They're natural humanists, natural therapists. They really understand the human condition. They are also, they easily notice clues to work off of. So when they're talking to another person, they're like studying them. They're very in tuned and attuned to the signals that other people are giving them, which is, of course, why they make very good therapists. And they are very driven to help them in terms of energy or emotions in any way that would really facilitate the other person's experience. So they're very tuned into individuals and very tuned into like, what is it that the person needs? Do they need me to hold their energy, their emotions? What's going on for this individual? And that attunement to others is part of what makes them sort of have like this really sophisticated way of experiencing sort of the multifaceted elements of life, because they're not just checking in with their own stuff. They're really attuned to other individuals.
So we know that all INFPs are good listeners, especially to other people's stories. This is probably the top of the list. Out of all four subtypes, the harmonizing INFP probably has an attunement to just sit there and really not just listen to somebody's story, but almost get into the person's experience, their perspective, where they're coming from. Like, well, if I was you, this is how I'd be feeling. Again, all INFPs can do this, but this is probably the one that lends itself more to that.
Well, and they're really good at sort of tuning into the complex interplay of clues that a person is giving off.
Yeah.
And then also keeping a storehouse of memories of how that person has been.
Yeah.
And so they're studying a person over time. And so they get this really intricate awareness of the layers of a person, how they're growing over time.
A composite.
Yeah, exactly. And so the patterns, the behavioral patterns that they have access to are very high because they've watched this person and not just like kind of studied their perspective, but like watched them change and grow over time and really being in tune with that individual. And so there's a certain level of insight into that person's journey, right? Not just the psychology of what they're showing up with at this time with a little bit of backstory, but like they're really in tuned with somebody's spiritual and psychological journey.
So this could be anything from maybe a criminal profiler as a job choice to a pastor, a counselor, a therapist, maybe even like a yoga instructor. I'm guessing like maybe more of like anything that has to do with mind, body, arts or practices, like massage therapist. This is probably that subtype here.
Yeah, potentially. What's interesting is I didn't see as much yoga instructor, but I did see things like massage therapist. Yeah. Right. Somebody kind of more in tune to sort of the energy piece of it.
So more healing than teaching. More like showing up and being part of the, I don't know, doing humaning well, like coming alongside. And I would also say maybe this might find in like HR, human resources, anything has to do with like any human dynamics that need people management.
Yeah, well, if you want me to read the list, I've got, the obvious clear one would be clinical psychologist or therapist, but anthropologist was on the list. Screenwriter.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody who's like writing about the human condition, novelist would also be up there. Community organizer, interestingly enough. Because of the capacity to sort of understand what's motivating people. Not so much the sort of the dominant subtype form of community organizer, but more like somebody who's sort of encouraging people to go do the thing that they think they should be doing to give back to the community. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
educator. There is a teaching component in here, but more like special needs educator, like somebody who's really in tune with what that person needs that other people might miss. Art teacher. They also mentioned like a Montessori style school teacher could also really fit into this kind of INFP. And then anything creative would also work. Music, that kind of thing. Like art therapy would be up there too.
Yeah.
And Dario mentions that they have a nose for understanding symbolic imagery in the unconscious, almost like reading a fine character novel. So again, it's almost like they turn everything into the human story, basically. They also excel in areas like international relations and family counseling could be a big top choice. And for themselves, they usually have a very rich inner world that includes their spiritual life that's almost beyond words to share. So they might have a really hard time communicating sort of the depth of their inner world. But he says that's what serious and humorous novels, plays, and films are for. So again, they might find an outlet in writing about the human condition in some form of fiction in order to just express the tiniest little bit of what's going on internally for them. So this is usually an older INFP.
Man, some of the characteristics you described sound like an INTJ or an INFJ.
I suspect that a harmonizing INFP is probably going to mistype as an INJ of some type, in some form.
If they're going to mistype.
If they're going to mistype.
Yeah. And so that's just something to be mindful of. You probably know you're an INFP listening, but some INFPs in our world, our clients, our students have struggled. Am I an INFJ? Am I an INFP? I don't know. And they've gone back and forth between those two. And maybe they were more this style of INFP, this more harmonizing style, which has more of those esoteric characteristics like you'd find in like an INFJ, for example.
Yeah. Well, and but I think what's really interesting is that the capacity for tracking a person's story, like watching them over time, which brings in for those of you who are type geeks, a little bit of that introverted sensing or memory.
Yeah.
The capacity to chart it and watch the other individual's changes. I think INJ types more sort of tap into the pattern as it is right now, whatever they're experiencing in the moment, since it's associated with extroverted sensing and figuring out that pattern. But I think that the strength of this kind of INFP really comes in being familiar with a person, really being able to watch their story. That's when those deep insights really strike them.
So from a neurotransmitter standpoint, estrogen is the choice here, or that's the proclivity or the desire. And then what about the function attunement? So we've got the two front functions. One is introverted feeling authenticity as the driver or dominant. The co-pilot auxiliary is extroverted intuition or exploration, what we've nicknamed it. So these two functions, cognitive functions an INFP uses, how are they attuned to give us this harmonizing subtype?
So the harmonizing subtype is the opposite of the dominant. And so if the dominants, both of those functions have an attunement that is analytic, both of these are a holistic preference. And so that they're both open-ended, diffused, taking as much territory as possible, but they don't have that assertive energy. So this is going to be a style of INFP that probably could also benefit from somebody who's really sort of helping support them do day-to-day stuff, kind of like the creative. They're also going to really benefit from people being able to see them for their talents. And so they might benefit from a little bit more of an assertive part of themselves coming up so they can sell themselves because they usually have a lot to offer.
Yeah. So if the dominant INFP would seek positions of leadership to be able to move up the ranks in a way, to get something done, to be in leadership, the creative probably needs to seek subsidization, like support from somebody or a platform to help support all the stuff that they want to do to be creative.
Yeah.
The normalizing probably needs to find some entity organization to join, like research department, or like get a job, like almost like go get an actual career at an institution to help support all that. This harmonizing.
And to make sure that they have a hobby that feeds their intuition.
This harmonizing, I think of like an actor who attaches themselves to a famous director. Like they always, like Quentin Tarantino or what's the guy that, Martin Scorsese, right? Like there's certain actors who have said, that guy, that's my director. Any movie he asks me to be in, I'm going to say yes no matter what, because I know that he knows his stuff and that movie's going to be successful. So I don't know how to navigate my career, but I'm going to attach myself or focus in on somebody else that has a lot of talent in this, and that's going to help me always have opportunity. So the principle here is, if you're a harmonizing INFP, maybe think of a principle like that. Maybe there's either a movement or a person or something that you can start to kind of lean in on that helps guide where you're going, gives you that energy and direction, because everything being diffused, like you talked about, both your cognitive functions, sometimes you don't know what you want to go toward, or sometimes you don't have the energy kicking up. But if you can attach to other people or other things, I think that could be really helpful for this subtype specifically.
Well, and unlike the creative subtype, I don't think this subtype has as much of a thirst for freedom in the same way.
Yeah.
They're less judgmental as a general rule than any of the other INFPs. In fact, they have a really hard time being judgmental. This is the INFP that doesn't want anybody judging anything ever because they're like, it's too complex. You can't understand it. And so if they find themselves in institutions, they usually are fine. Yeah. They're like, okay, like as long as they have a good gig that allows them to do the thing that they're doing well, they're not going to push away from an institution or organization like a creative INFP might.
Sure.
They're less likely to get in a rut, right, than the normalizing INFP. So they're kind of in a good position. The big challenge of being this kind of INFP is that there is a very difficult time truly communicating what's going on. Even if they have, like all INFPs do, a talent for language, this INFP feels like it's going to be, they're going to die with all that richness inside of them, basically. Yeah. And so that's one of the disadvantages. But again, it's almost always an older INFP that reaches the harmonizing place.